So God is able then to forgive any of the mistakes that a prophet or messenger commits, so long as it's not misguiding other people. If it's mistakes that apply to their own selves, it's only them harming their own rank. It's only them that are going down in degree. It's only them that are basically showing that they have not enough faith or certitude. God can forgive that, because that's a sin between them and God. So now we have this taking place, and we covered the Ulil Azm prophets, and those are the best of them. And so let's quickly kind of like highlight, lest somebody say, that maybe some of the other prophets didn't have mistakes. It's very clear that all of them did. We have Enoch in narrations. He prayed that God bring down the punishment upon the people, and this is a common mistake that many of the prophets did, including Hosea, questioning God's mercy and calling down the punishment upon their people. And this was a mistake that many of the prophets were chastised for, right?
Yeah.
That's a common one that you see.
I think even Noah, right, in the narrations,
even Noah, he lost patience and he called down the punishment upon his people. And in the narrations, God chastises him for that in the story of the potter, and you know that story.
Yeah, it's such a heartbreaking story, but it's...
Tell us about it.
Okay, so Noah, after the flood, he was working as making pottery, and somebody came up and said that he has to now, God is ordering that he smash and destroy all of this pottery that he's made, and he's so sad and heartbroken at the thought of destroying all that he had worked to create. And the point of the story is that it's a metaphor for how God felt about humanity, because Noah had lost his patience. Before the flood, he had enough. And at some point he called, to God to send the punishment, to destroy the people. Because, we spoke about the people were nasty to him, the people were attacking him and speaking bad to him. So he lost his patience and he said, God, destroy them. So the lesson was, if he felt that way about destroying his pottery, imagine how God felt about destroying all of his creation. And that's a very, very heartbreaking lesson. Yeah, I find that story extremely heartbreaking.
It is. And so you have that. You have Prophet Elijah.
He ran away.
He gets frightened.
Yeah.
And he kind of like, even though great miracles happen at his hand, when he's faced, and he knows that he's going to have to face Jezebel, what happens? He runs away.
Yeah.
And he basically like tells God, like, I please take me away, like cause me to die, because I'm done. He's a suicidal prophet. He doesn't commit suicide, but he wishes his own death. And so he enters kind of in this category with a long list of prophets that got so hopeless at one point, let's say, or they lost hope or certitude in themselves, that they wished death upon themselves. One of them, or ran away from the mission, like Jonah.
Yeah.
So you have Elijah. You have also Jeremiah, who commits a great mistake when he basically says, "La'natullah on the day that I was born. May God curse the day that I was born." Like and he's wishing death because of the persecution that's taking place against him during his days. So this lack of faith brought these prophets in particular less down in degree. We mentioned Jonah before, and we know that story. You also have the mistakes that were committed by Prophet Joseph when he was dependent upon God in the Quran and in the Torah. He was dependent upon somebody else other than God to release him from the prison. Instead of asking God to release him from prison, he tells one of the prisoners that's going to be released to mention his name, to intercede for him with Pharaoh, so that he can be released. And because of this act of almost polytheism, Tiffany, which is taking place. Joseph, basically God decides to punish Joseph by leaving him in prison for many, many other years. And
it's hard. It's really hard because on a human level, you read these stories and you find them understandable. But for the prophets and the messengers, it's almost like saying God forgot about him, and you know, like you don't remind God about you. Like it wouldn't make sense. So,
and it's also fascinating that a prophet, you would never think that the prophet would ever want to or have to resort to even thinking about asking for help from somebody else because they have God with them.
Yeah, it's true.
The Quran also mentions that when Zulaykha was thinking about Joseph, it says she was thinking about him and he was thinking about her. And so it doesn't explicitly say that Joseph committed an act of fornication with her or anything like that. But the Quran makes it clear that he was thinking about her and she was a married woman. And so that was also one of the mistakes. And the mistakes of Joseph also almost made him go out of the list of the prophets and the messengers because they were so severe, but yet because nobody was misguided because of them and because they repented, he retained his place.
Wow. It's heavy. That he almost, I mean, a prophet like Joseph, who we know his story, and he's loved and revered by Jews, Christians, Muslims, like that he made mistakes that, you know, it was just a thin line that he was walking.
David and Solomon, they also committed mistakes according to the Torah, the Bible, the narrations of the prophet and the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam. And the Quran, basically one of the stories of David was that he lusted after a married woman. And this is mentioned prominently in the Torah. And he looks outside of the window and he sees a woman and she's showering and he decides that he wants her. And so he calls the guards to get her. And even though he knows that she's married, he commits this relationship with her. She becomes pregnant. And her husband comes back. He was a soldier in the army in the ranks of David. And this is the Israelites' greatest king. Like the Jews, they love David. There is no reason to keep this story in their books if they're trying to propagate the faith of Judaism. Why would they do something like that?
Right. Why would they invent a story like that? It's unfathomable that it could be like a corruption. I mean, I've heard the argument that this story must be false, like from Muslims who don't believe that David would have done such a thing.
Any story that has to do with anything that is against the Muhammadan jurisprudence, they'll claim it's a false story. Okay. But yet this particular story, and we'll have an episode to talk about this in the future. This particular story actually is mentioned in the Quran in an indirect way. Okay, and that is in regards to the verses that are talking about the 99 sheep, and people can go back and read the parable that the Prophet Nathan gave David, and between the verse and the Quran, and you'll see that it's exactly the same story that's being mentioned there. So David takes this very dedicated soldier of his who just got back, and he tells him, look, go sleep with Bathsheba, go to your wife's house. Okay, you've been fighting in this war, now you're home, go be with your wife. His intention is that he sleeps with his wife so that when Bathsheba gives birth or her pregnancy shows, he could say, oh, and nobody would doubt that this woman had fornicated, basically, or that child was David's. They would just think that it was
Uriah's.
Exactly. But what happens is that the soldier is way too dedicated. He says, God forbid that I ever go down and enjoy myself with my wife while my fellow brothers are out there fighting on the field. You know, I'm just going to sit right here next to you, David. I ain't going nowhere. That's what he said. And David is beginning to feel nervous, and so he devises this plan, and he decides that he's going to send him back out to the battlefield, but he's going to put him on the front lines. And his intention was that he gets killed by the Philistines, and actually he ends up getting killed. And then David takes Bathsheba as a wife, and God is upset with that, and God sends Nathan to chastise David, and David ends up basically
passing judgment on his own self.
Yeah, passing judgment on his own self, and he ends up losing the child that Bathsheba is pregnant with, but God in the end forgives him, and she gets pregnant with Solomon instead. Now, somebody could say, well, this is a major sin. I mean, but once again, the wife and the husband, none of them went into misguidance. None of them disbelieved, right?
Yeah, nobody was misguided from that.
Bathsheba, she had a duty that she had to obey the messenger of God, and that's exactly what she did. She obeyed the messenger of God, even if he was commanding her to do something, or even if he did something with her that was considered to be a sin, right? Normally, that a woman who's married should not have relations with another man. She still stuck to obeying the messenger in her time. And she still, basically, she recognized that the messenger had more of a right over her than her own self. And we find that a similar incident takes place in the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where his son is married, Zayd, his adopted son, is married to a woman, and the narrations state that Muhammad expressed a comment about the beauty of his daughter-in-law. Mm-hmm. And when Zayd found out about it, Zayd offers to divorce his wife in order to give it to his father, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he actually does so. He divorces, and Muhammad marries the wife of his adopted son. Yeah. Just like David married Bathsheba. Yeah. Because in both incidents, there's this golden rule, and that is that the right of the prophet or the messenger over the people is the right of God over the people, right? Because they're the messenger of God. Yeah. Now, whether or not the messenger is abusing that right or not, this is something that God will judge them on, but it's always the duty of the people to submit to and to obey and to follow the prophet and messenger in that time. So Bathsheba didn't make a mistake. She actually does the right thing. She submits to David. She gives herself because she realizes that the prophet or the messenger in her time has more of a right over her than her husband does or herself. And that's why the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he stood in front of the people and he said what? He said in his farewell speech, and in other instances, he says to them, do I not have more of a right over you than your own self? And they say, no, you do, O Messenger of Allah. Then he says, whoever I'm the master of, Ali is the master of, right? Yeah. And that means that me and Ali, we both have more right over you than your own mothers and your fathers do. We find Jesus also emphasizing this concept when he says, whoever loves their mother or their father over me is not worthy of me, right? Yeah, so yeah. And Muhammad, when he says that me and Ali are the fathers of this nation, right? And the father always has ultimate right over his children. And so Bathsheba doesn't make a mistake, and neither does her husband. Really, David just obviously his intention was that before this man get killed, and this was the major problem that God had with David. And the narrations state that the angels and God basically they speak to the husband of Bathsheba in the afterlife, and they say to him, do you forgive David or you don't? You have two choices. Either we extract punishment on David, and it seems like David's going to be wiped out from the list of the prophets and messengers for this act, or you forgive him and we will give you the same rank that David has. And so he chooses the latter, and David's forgiven, and he's given the same rank as David was given.
Wow, that's amazing. I have to say the analysis of that you just gave of this story is something that I've never heard from any other person on earth, and it makes it completely understandable how the prophet can make a mistake between themselves and God, and yet there is not this misguidance of the people, and all of the people, they've actually done everything right according to the requirement from them, which is that they have to obey the messenger of God. So I've never heard anybody actually put this story in that context, and it's one of those controversial stories, and I think it's essential to understanding it, actually, that the way that you've explained it.
And then you have Solomon.
Yeah.
Solomon, he's got all kinds of riches. He's got a kingdom that God has never given to anybody else before. God grants him this kingdom and power over all things, the jinn, the people, the winds. The kingdom will never repeat itself, except that it's given in the end times to the Mahdi or the Qa'im from the family of Muhammad. The narrations state that he's given a kingdom that's likened to the kingdom of Solomon. But Solomon seems to, according to the Jewish narrations and what's written in the Torah and the Bible and some Islamic narrations, kind of abuse this authority. He has arrogance that happens, and this is a mistake. And he's even put back into his place by an ant in one story, which she, boasts to him how wrong he was about thinking that he is above all other creatures of God. And this queen ant, when he's marching, the ant basically, starts saying Solomon's going to destroy us and step over us. And so Solomon stands there and he says, "Who's saying this about me?" And the ant says, "Why don't you put out your hand and raise me up, and you'll see who's saying this." And he puts down his hand, and the ant crawls on his hand, and he raises the hand up, and he's looking at the ant. And, the ant makes the point that, actually, I'm better than you. And the reason why is because you're lifting me, see, on your hand. Wow. If I wasn't better than you, then you wouldn't be lifting me. But here you are, you're lifting me. And then Solomon throws it down, and he kind of gets put into check in this very beautiful story. But that's not the major mistake, is it, that Solomon did? Solomon was also, he was living very lavishly. Yeah. With lots of riches, lots of gold and silver and statues and things of delight in this world. Yeah. And it caused the Israelites to actually not like him so much. Yeah. Okay. And one of the reasons why the Israelites end up rebelling against Solomon and not accepting his progeny to rule after him is because of the very fact that they saw that he was living too lavishly, and it wasn't matching the stories of the prophets and messengers before. And he had 700 wives, permanent wives, and he had 300 concubines. So this man had 1,000 women that he would, be with, and more wives on record than any other prophet and messenger in history. Yeah, for sure. That's the most that I've ever heard of. And I was thinking there is sort of a mistake with the scriptural basis. It's written in the Bible that God advised him not to marry certain women who are not worshiping God. Yeah, they were
polytheistic women. And he did it anyway, and they kind of led his heart astray.
Yeah, so what happened with Solomon is that he has all these wives. There's men that are married to one wife, and they struggle to find enough time between work and taking care of the kids, and between their own duties that they have to take care of and responsibilities, and between giving the wife enough time. And so imagine Solomon, who didn't just have 4 wives, but he had 1,000. How is he going to spend time with all of these wives? How is he going to spend time and be equal and just with all of their children? It's an impossible task, right?
Oh, yeah.
If you spend one night with one wife, imagine.
It's like 4 years later.
Imagine in this day and age, you have 1,000 wives. What are you supposed to do? You have a movie night with one of the wives, and if you do the same thing with each wife, it's going to be like 3-4 years before you come around to the first wife to spend more time with her again.
It's
right?
not just
that's assuming that you have a few days in between for yourself too.
Yeah.
So basically, when you're checking up on your wife every couple of years, you don't know what's going on in their lives. And many of them were basically practicing idolatry in secret. And many of them were going forward in the land and building temples for their gods from their own countries. They were importing these religions into Israel. And because of this, it ends up leading to major catastrophes that take place later in Israel's history, where people start worshiping false gods, and all of Israel split into two, a southern kingdom and a northern kingdom, right? Yeah. And Jeroboam and Rehoboam are fighting against each other, and there's all these splits that are taking place due to this. So that was one of the major mistakes that Prophet Solomon is highlighted for in the Torah especially. What else do we have?
A mistake from Solomon, you mean?
No, or from any of the prophets,
from any of the prophets and messengers.
So you find John the Baptist also at some point in the Bible when he's asked whether or not Jesus is the Messiah and he's imprisoned. Yeah. It seems like he's unsure.
He says, "Go ask him."
He says, "Go ask him." And so there's a little bit of the certitude's not there in that moment. And pretty much, we could be talking about this topic for many, many hours, but I think we're well over. And right now, I think this is the longest episode that we've made so far. So in order to bring it to a close and to keep things concise, I do want to bring attention to the Muslims and to everybody, the verse in the Quran, which states, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And until the time that the prophets or the messengers lose hope and think that they are belied. This is a verse in the Quran. And until the moment that the messengers lose hope and think that they are belied. So in this verse from the Quran, the word messengers, it's not something which is it's not worded in a way that would be talking about specific messengers or some messengers, but it's talking about all of the messengers. Until the messengers lose hope and think that they were belied. So at some point, all of the messengers had thought that they were lied to. And all of the messengers at some point in their path with God come to a point of pretty much losing hope. Then comes the victory of God at that point. And in the interpretation of the verse by the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says that the meaning of this verse was that God had removed at certain points his infallibility from the messengers, or he removes that enforcement from the messengers and allowed them to only depend on themselves instead of depending on God. And it was at those moments, without the Holy Spirit, without the enforcement of God, that the messengers thought, whether it was for a split moment like in the case of Jesus when he says, God, please move this cup away from me, or it was like in the case of some of the prophets and messengers like Jonah that actually ran away. It was a long period. These messengers thought, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, that the shaitans, the demons, were the ones that were coming to them in the forms of angels in order to deceive them.
Oh my God.
So imagine that.
That is heavy.
It is extremely heavy, because it means that all those 124,000 prophets that came to humanity, they had a greater struggle, and they had a greater test, and it really does show the justice of God, and it shows that life wasn't easier for them because they were hearing the voice of God or speaking to the angels, but in fact, life was more difficult for them because even though they were hearing and seeing these magnificent things, like in the case of Moses, there's a hadith that states when they're asked, like one of the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam is asked, what was the voice that spoke to Moses like? His response was, it was a voice that he heard in his head that was coming from 360 directions, right?
Yeah.
360 degrees. It was coming from all directions. But nobody else heard it. Only Moses heard it. So imagine, yes, he's hearing it, but now he has to have enough faith and certitude that it's not a demon.
Yeah.
He has to have enough faith and certitude that it's not him going crazy.
Hallucination.
It's not a hallucination.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I think we read these stories and we don't put ourselves in the shoes of the prophets and the messengers and imagine what it would have been like to be them.
So the prophets and the messengers, they struggled more, and they had more faith, and it needed to be there in order that they continue their message. And it's because they had that enough faith that they would be able to remain firm that God chose them for that message. So then I think we've covered everything now, except for maybe one thing, which is a little bit still vague. And that is, okay, that's great. That's wonderful. You know, but then still they might have questions on why is it that Muhammad and his family, you know, like are better than all of the prophets and messengers? Why is their infallibility higher than all of the prophets and the messengers that came before? And the reason being is a fascinating one. And it's also a very sensible one. And that is because the prophets and the messengers, they were all in a race, Tiffany. And the believers were all in a race. Creation was all in a race. Some of them failed and became non-believers. Some of them were believers and passed. And the best of the believers became prophets. And from the best of the prophets were chosen messengers. And from the best of the messengers, the 313, were chosen, right? So it's billions of people. Mm-hmm. And from them, 124,000 become prophets. Mm-hmm. And from them, 313 become messengers. And from them, 5 become ulil azm. And from those 5, only one has inherent infallibility, and that is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason why he's inherently infallible is because he reaches that degree of being 2 bows or less to God, and he disintegrates into the veil of God. He and all of creation. Because anybody who is absolutely infallible is God. There's nobody who's absolutely infallible, even without a thought that would pass by their minds or a struggle in their heart, except for God. So anything less than God has this black dot at least, of imperfection, or that sin. And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he too, because he was a creation, had that black dot of imperfection. And if he didn't have it, then he wouldn't be a creature. He would be the creator.
Okay.
But he reached the rank where he got so close to God that he managed to ask God to forgive him for what has come forward from his sin and what has been delayed, right? And what he was talking about was this sin of existence, this little imperfection that he had in relation to God's perfection, and God forgives him for that. And so this forgiveness of that sin, right, that the other prophets and messengers, because of their lack of reaching that same degree of closeness, they weren't able to ask for that forgiveness, where Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam managed to do so. So God forgiving Muhammad for this sin of existing caused Muhammad's total nature to be perfect and him to have inherent infallibility, as did his household, because he asked for them as well. And the Imams, they started a new page. Muhammad started a new page because Muhammad became God in creation. And when we talk about monotheism, we're going to talk about what that means, that Muhammad became God in creation. So I don't want to go too much more into it. But now the successors of Muhammad, the Imams and the Mahdis, they have a more difficult job than the prophets and the messengers did. And that's because the prophets and the messengers did hear God's commandments, and they spoke to him through the angels. But the Imams and the Mahdis, they did not speak to God, and they were there. So their certitude had to be even greater than the prophets and the messengers, because they have to face everything that the prophets and the messengers faced, but yet still have the same level of certitude and resilience that the rest of the prophets and the messengers did. So it's like being sent as a messenger when you're an Imam or Mahdi, but without receiving divine revelations from God, and only having those instructions that came from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the spirit of enforcement, or the Holy Spirit, to guide you on your path. So the prophets and the messengers, they had divine enforcement, and they had instruction and constant communication with God. The Imams and the Mahdis, they have the Holy Spirit, and they have these instructions, but from Muhammad, and not constant communication with God. So they need an even higher level of certitude. And that's why the Imams start off with having this inherent infallibility, versus the rest of the Prophet and the messengers having this earned infallibility, and because of Muhammad's night journey. So anyway, we'll stop there, because it is a very complex topic, and we've talked for a very long time now. I'm so sorry for talking too much.
Please, I could go on for hours.
I hope that you forgive me for that.
No, please. I've enjoyed today's conversation so much, and like I said, I would love to continue it, and I can't wait to continue it next time. Thank you so much for all that you've taught me today. It has been incredible and really enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. God bless you.